Hello and welcome to Music and Art in the Catholic Tradition, Module 3, Lesson 3. Today we're going to be talking about idealism in art and how that relates to the Renaissance aesthetic and style. To do that, we're going to be looking at several examples of art by Michelangelo, the Pietà, which is one of my absolute favorite sculptures of all time, the Last Judgment, and to a lesser extent, the Sistine Chapel ceiling. We'll look at it. The Smart History video on it was particularly good because it ties in with the Last Judgment. And in general, I just love all of the videos that they do. So whenever they have one that's on a topic that we can use for this class, I almost always go for it. So let's get started. Now, we've already talked about Renaissance art and Renaissance music for 2 lessons now, but we've gotten far enough into it that hopefully you'll be able to tell the difference. You'll be able to tell the difference between Renaissance and medieval art immediately, but in some of the larger details. But hopefully you've gotten a familiarity with it by this point now so that we can talk about style characteristics overall without them being just sort of this abstract thing that we're talking about. It can be something that you've lived, that you've experienced personally, so that hopefully it'll have a more lasting impression on your memory of music and art. So the medieval style, as we've seen, emphasizes the mathematical relationships in proportion. In music, that was especially true. You were talking about isorhythm and interval relationships that emphasize perfect proportions, even if they may not sound as good as they possibly could. And in architecture, we still see an emphasis on proportion and order. We also see this turn towards greater embellishment that we did not see in the Romanesque style. And we're talking about the Gothic style now. And part of that is just increased resources. Greater ability on the part of artisans allows for more detail, more complexity. Another part of it is the tradition of troping and embellishing of texts that leads to the embellishment of music, that leads to greater complexity in music, and the embellishment of, anything, belts or crowns or tables, that leads naturally to an embellishment of architectural works as well. And that might be another way, just as an aside, that we explain this emphasis on the new in Tinctoris's treatise. The idea being that take the old things that are good and add to them and make them even better by means of embellishment and addition, rather than creating something entirely new, but just adding new techniques or new advances in the science to make it better. But in any case, we didn't really look at many examples of medieval painting, so I'm going to give you a few examples here just so that you can contrast them with the Renaissance. And of course, the big claim to fame of Renaissance art is that it revives the Greek and Roman style of the past, especially in sculpture, but the techniques that are used to make sculpture realistic, like it was in the ancient Greek and Roman tradition, is also added to the other visual arts, especially painting. So we talked about naturalism or realism last time in the Dolce reading and lecture. The idea that for painting to be good, it needs to be as close to photorealistic. That's sort of what he's getting at, although of course they didn't have photos at the time. As close to photorealistic as possible. He doesn't really have much to say, at least in the excerpts that we read, about idealism, and that is putting into a work something that isn't there in order to emphasize intangible qualities the ideal. And we see that, especially in the works of Michelangelo, we see that incredibly and very movingly in his Pietà. And it is not something that is new. We don't see idealism in the medieval art, the painting and sculpture. We see a lot of symbolism. We see things standing for other things and things being representations of other things. But we don't really see idealism so much. That is the idea that something looks real, but it's better than real. But we have seen that before the medieval era. We saw it in ancient Greece and Rome. If you remember the sculptures, the bronzes, the Riace bronzes that were pulled out of the Mediterranean and are totally in excess of a realistic representation of a human. They have no coccyx bone, so they are anatomically incorrect in that respect. The groove in the center of their abdomen and down their back are deeper than they could possibly be on a real human. They have a thick belt of muscle at the bottom of their abdomen that divides their body in half. Their legs are way too long, and so on and so forth. They are not realistic, they are idealistic. They are a representation of the truth, if we're looking at it from Plato's perspective. They are the representation of the truth behind humanity, the perfection behind humanity, if we want to look at it from St. Augustine's perspective as well. And so they cannot look like a real human and reach that perfection because real humans are imperfect. So now let's turn to Michelangelo's Pietà, and you can see that he's doing the same thing here that we see in the Riace bronzes. Look at Mary. I want to focus on Mary specifically. Now, this is touched on a little bit in the Smart History video, but I really want to emphasize it here. Look at the size of Jesus. Look at the size of his body, and of course marvel at the real detail and the realistic quality of his body. Realism is not being thrown out with idealism, it's just being enhanced by idealism. And now look at Mary. How tall must Mary be? How wide must Mary be? How thick must she be in order to hold Jesus' body that way? He is a full-grown man in this sculpture, and yet she is in all ways almost twice his size. Look at how much, look under his arm where she's holding him up. Look at how large her hand is compared to his body. She's absolutely massive. That is not an accurate representation of, we don't know if it's an accurate representation of Mary, but we wouldn't expect a woman to be that much bigger than a man, especially not her own son. It would be one thing if they weren't related and, she came from a family of really tall people and he came from a family of really short people or something like that, but that's his own mother. So she is much, much bigger. And we can just speculate as to why that is. There's no right answer. We don't have Michelangelo's notes saying, I'm going to make her twice as big for this reason. So this is a perfect example of where we can really engage with the art and draw our own conclusions. But we know he's doing something idealistic here. It's not supposed to be realistic. And then we really just have to figure out why. I don't want to give you too much of what I think her being extra large is for. I think they mention a little teeny bit about it in their own perspective in the Smart History videos about why she's so large. But I'd really just like to hear your opinions about it, so I'm not going to say anything more, and we can discuss it in the discussion board. But you're seeing a perfect example of idealism, just like we saw in the Riace bronzes. And he's getting it from the same place. And we can see this idealism again also in the Last Judgment. And they talk a lot more about this in the Smart History videos than they did in relation to the Pietà. Look at the body of Christ, dead center in the Last Judgment. His torso is massive, his head is much smaller, his arms and legs are probably a little bit shorter than they should be compared to that massive torso. All of the bodies are incredibly muscular, way too thick, way too muscular for their heads and bodies. And this is not meant to be realistic. This is meant to be more than realistic. So then we can ask again, so we've identified it as idealistic somehow. The other possibility, I suppose, would be some sort of deliberate grotesqueness, where the goal wouldn't be to enhance the beauty or enhance the message behind it, but rather to distort for the purpose of making something deliberately ugly. But I don't think it's meant to be deliberately ugly. This is, the Last Judgment. This is supposed to be for all righteous Christians a good time, and for the damned, not such a good time. But in any case, we can get a clue as to what is going on here if we remember back to Aquinas when he's talking about, in that passage that we read, when he's talking about what happens after the Last Judgment, when God perfects our bodies and what we'll look like. And he says that our bodies will look the same because we'll be the same. We'll have the same nature. Our nature will just be perfected. And so the same thing, we might say, is what Michelangelo is going for here. These people, and also Christ and the saints and the angels and all, are perfect. They are perfected. And so their bodies are more than they could ever be on earth. They're way more muscular, because you can imagine, even back in Michelangelo's time, even back in the Renaissance, some people were very physically fit and very muscular, and I'm sure people appreciated that, liked that, thought it was attractive, even the way we do now. And so you might imagine them looking at that and thinking that is what the human form is perfected. Then you only have to take that one step farther and perfect it to a degree that's not possible in the physical form, and then you get this. You get a body that is muscle-bound in a way that is not possible, I guess, without steroids. And it's, again, not meant to be realistic, but you might call it hyper-realistic or idealistic. So one of the big differences between the medieval and the Renaissance, in terms of art, visual art especially, painting and sculpture, is that in the medieval era we have a lot of symbolism. We have caricatures of people that look sort of cartoony by modern standards. There's not a lot of detail, but there's a lot of symbolism. Things are made larger than they should be. People are surrounded by people that they shouldn't be surrounded by, and things like that, to get a message across, to create some sort of symbolism. Now, in the Renaissance, we also have symbolism. We haven't gotten rid of it. Like the trumpets and Sharon's boat down there, and other aspects of the Last Judgment here are symbolic. They are representative things. They're not representative of reality, although they might be, because, of course, this is in the future, and so no one can say whether it is what reality would look like or not. But there's also an idealism for all these individual things, for the scene as a whole, and there's an emphasis on the character of the piece. There's an emphasis on the morality behind it, the teaching of a lesson, the ideal or the idea that's behind it. Everything in the painting is serving the goal of the idea, of the message, not in a symbolic way alone, but also in a sort of idealized way. This is, the perfect representation of the judgment, the Last Judgment from Michelangelo's perspective. Anyway, That is Lesson 3 of Module 3. Let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to discussing this material with you in the discussion forum. And I will see you next time. Until then, wherever you are, have a great day.